My name is Chase Oliver, and this is my presentation on 6 Degrees of History. Because of Nat Turner's rebellion and the Freedmen's Bureau, therefore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a significant effect of the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Virginia Plan was a proposal that took place saying representation in both of the houses was based on the population of the state. This benefited larger southern states because of the size of the state, and the enslaved population was much greater. The New Jersey Plan proposal said each state would have equal representation in Congress. New Jersey representatives proposed this to make sure they could have an equal say in Congress, since the state is much smaller in population and size. To resolve this, the Three-Fifths Compromise was created to solve the issue of how the enslaved people could be counted for representation. Before, all enslaved people were considered as property and not recognized as people. The compromise decided that an enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The Three-Fifths Compromise showed the true injustice faced by African Americans. It showed the dehumanization they faced as they were treated as property rather than citizens. These enslaved people wanted to have freedom and rights in America, which led to furious uprisings against their masters. This continuation of dehumanization from the masters to the enslaved people led to more and more rebellions that grew larger and larger. One of these well-known rebellions that made an impact was the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. Because of the dehumanization of enslaved people and the shared desire for freedom, therefore Nat Turner's rebellion was a significant effect of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Nat Turner's Rebellion. Many slave rebellions were beginning to be carried out, which could have inspired Nat Turner's rebellion. Denmark Vesey's conspiracy was an African-American slave rebellion in 1822, where a man named Denmark Vesey bought his freedom and organized a conspiracy to recruit African-Americans and enslaved people and escape to Haiti. Before this plan could be carried out, he was caught and was put to death with many other supporters. Nat Turner was an African-American slave who lived in Virginia, born on October 2nd, 1800. Turner was a religious man who believed that he was chosen by God to lead all the enslaved people to freedom. In August of 1831, he led a rebellion against slaveholders on plantations around Southampton County, Virginia, leading to the death of 65 white people before being stopped by federal troops. Following this, many white people began to kill black people, resulting in around 120 African Americans being killed. This rebellion led to very harsh slave codes and treatment towards blacks in the South, while northern abolitionist movements over slavery increased. Nat Turner's rebellion influenced many future abolitionist movements and brought to light the humanity that enslaved people had and their shared resistance to oppression. The rebellion forced Americans to realize the fault in enslaving human beings and showed that enslaved people aren't passive and can join together to fight for the desire for freedom. The rebellion inspired abolitionists to bring awareness to the cause by writing newspaper articles such as William Garrison's The Liberator and Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Because of resistance from enslaved people and abolitionist movements, therefore, Nat Turner's rebellion was a significant cause for the creation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin. In the mid-1800s, slavery was a very controversial topic between the North and South. The northern states had been outlawing slavery in the late 1700s, starting with Vermont in 1777, followed by Massachusetts in 1783. The industrial economy of the North had made the need for slavery irrelevant. However, the South felt otherwise, relying on slavery to keep plantations running and profitable. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a novel written in 1852, bringing to light the realities of life these enslaved people faced every day. It described the abuse they faced physically and emotionally, showed the problems with slavery and the cruelty of work, and the separation of families. The novel created the debate over nationwide abolishment, leading to the South to recognize it as anti-slavery propaganda, as they saw it as a threat to their way of life since slavery fueled their economy and increased the North's abolitionist movements. Uncle Tom's Cabin had an enormous impact on society, creating debates about the morality of slavery. The conflicts this book created between the North and South ignited Civil War opinions. The Civil War resulted in the North defeating the receded South and reinstating the southern states into the Union. During the Civil War, President Lincoln initiated the Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that enslaved people in Confederate states were to be set free. This eradicated slavery in the U.S., which was followed by the 13th Amendment, signed on December 6, 1865, which abolished it entirely. Millions of formerly enslaved people had nowhere to live. The government released the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave these African Americans abandoned land that was confiscated in the Civil War and the protection of civil rights. Because of conflicting opinions on the morality of slavery and the treatment of enslaved people being shared with the public, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a significant cause for the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau. The Civil War between the North and the South began on April 12, 1861, over the recession of the South out of the Union over the abolishment of slavery. This war spanned just under 4 years, ending on April 9, 1865, with Southern Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendering to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. During the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free all enslaved people in Confederate states. The Freedmen's Bureau was a result of this. It gave the formerly enslaved African Americans land to live on and officially granted them civil rights. One of the main purposes of the Bureau was to provide education and employment to the African American people so they could assimilate into American society. The Freedmen's Bureau was a large step in the right direction for African Americans' rights and freedom. It finally recognized them as humans and citizens rather than property by helping them acquire land, education, and rights. It granted them the civil rights that they deserved after being treated unjustly for just over 100 years, and they were encouraged to receive an education and have employment opportunities. Being granted these opportunities upset many people, especially white Southerners who believed that African Americans were inferior to them and should not be granted civil rights. This resulted in the Jim Crow South and Jim Crow laws, which were racially segregating laws in the South that were put in place to discriminate against the Black Americans. Because of African Americans assimilating into society and white Southerners refusing to coexist with Black Americans, therefore Jim Crow laws were a significant effect of the Freedmen's Bureau. Jim Crow laws. The reinstatement of the South into the Union and the Emancipation Proclamation came with an upset Southern society. White people in the South did not want to coexist with Black Americans, and as a result, they instituted the Jim Crow laws in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. These were local laws enforcing racial segregation and an economic, educational, and societal disadvantage. The segregation mandate included everything such as drinking fountains, restrooms, restaurants, schools, and public transportation. They were forced to work low-paying jobs in poor working conditions and even had to resort to sharecropping. Sharecropping was a system that provided land, farming equipment, and sometimes housing in exchange for the person receiving a percentage of the produced crops. It exploited poor African Americans who needed work and housing, and it left them poor and in debt. The law also found loopholes to prevent African Americans from voting. These votes required literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation tactics. These measures that were taken were effectively prevented the voting of African Americans in the South. The segregated Black schools were extremely underfunded and poorly equipped, which produced uneducated Black children and gave them limited opportunities, which led to poverty. These local laws negatively impacted the African American community as they had fought for their freedom and rights just so they could end up being neglected in society and set up to live in poverty. Although these segregation laws were in place, the Black community stuck together and fought for their equality with protests and boycotts. The Montgomery bus boycott came about when a Black woman named Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus and was jailed for it. The Black community organized a one-day boycott on December 5, 1955, which was led by E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson. This successful boycott led to the continued boycott and more protests for civil rights, led by the MIA president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because of extreme racial discrimination in the South and a desire for equality within society, therefore Jim Crow laws were a significant effect of the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Black activists in the civil rights movement participated in many different events fighting for equality and black rights. On August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech in front of 250,000 people who gathered together in Washington, D.C., known as the I Have a Dream speech. This speech became a defining moment in the movement, causing more people to rally behind them in their cause, leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, and sex. Less than a year later, on August 6, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which targeted the literacy tests, intimidation, and poll taxes that were enforced on African Americans from the Jim Crow laws. This act significantly increased African American voter registration, with millions registering in the years following. One important aspect of the act was the authorization of the federal government to oversee legislation and the elections to prevent discriminatory practices. In an attempt to prevent the disenfranchisement of voters, the act suspended literacy tests that were formerly required in certain areas, especially African Americans in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the many major victories in the civil rights movement. It empowered African American voters and was a monumental movement for political representation and participation for minority groups. The act advanced the cause of racial equality in the United States, and it ensured that all citizens of any race were given the right to fully participate in the voting process. Due to the increase in representation for minority groups, many more African Americans were being voted into public office at the local, state, and federal levels. Robert C. Henry, former mayor of Springfield, Ohio in 1966, was one of the first African Americans to be named mayor in a city of a significant size. Howard Enley was the first Black American mayor of a white southern town called Chapel Hill in North Carolina in 1969. Because of political intimidation and literacy tests to prevent Black Americans from voting, therefore, the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a significant cause for the structure of American society today. Here are my citations. Thank you for listening.